At Central United Methodist Church in Galveston. We'll hear from the pastors there and to hear their stories that I know will inspire all of us. So welcome to the two of you, and can't wait to hear what you've got to share with us today.
Thank you, Bishop. Good afternoon, friends. My name is Reverend Julia Riley, and one of the co-pastors at Central, and I am a white female clergy adult.
Hey, conference, my name is Michael Gienger. I'm also one of the pastors at Central, and I'm a white male adult clergy person. Before we start our talk, just wanted to give a quick disclaimer, a quick note. It's important to us that you know that every story that we share today, every photo that we share today is shared with explicit and enthusiastic consent from our community. Poverty tourism is a real industry and not one that we are interested in supporting. And so our folks were thrilled that you would get to hear their stories today. So please know that comes with excitement and joy from the Central community. A few years ago, a man named Tony came walking into our church. Actually, that's not quite totally true. Tony didn't walk into our church because Tony couldn't walk. He dragged himself into our church because Tony lived with a leg that no longer worked anymore. As a 20-something-year-old, Tony had worked as a landscaper, mowing lawns and cutting grass as a way of making a living. And one day there was an accident with a lawnmower, the kind of accident that changes a life in an instant. Tony's right leg no longer faced forward, it now faced behind him, and he went into emergency surgery, but the surgery failed. And his foot was left unusable. And if that wasn't enough, something else happened to Tony. Doctors stopped seeing a patient and began seeing a liability, malpractice lawsuits. No one wanted to touch Tony's leg again. It was too risky. It was too complicated. And so Tony adapted as best he could. For decades, Tony moved through the world with tremendous pain. He became homeless. He slept outside. He survived. But survival has a way of shrinking one's imagination about what life could become. And by the time that Tony dragged himself through the doors of Galveston Central Church, he had spent nearly 40 years living this way.
So for the last 4 years, Central has hosted what is known as Grace Clinic. And Grace Clinic is a free medical clinic created in partnership with physicians and nurses and therapists and medical students and social workers and all kinds of other providers and students from the University of Texas Medical Branch. During the week, old Sunday school classrooms transform into clinical spaces. Folding tables become documentation stations, hallways become waiting rooms. And these same spaces also host our substance use disorder clinic, where physicians and recovery specialists help people begin treatment and pursue recovery. Last year, our clinic served almost 800 unique patients with 4,230 patient encounters. To be honest, none of this began because we had some grand strategic vision about becoming a healthcare provider. It began because we started paying attention.
See, people in our neighborhood, where our church was located, were being discharged from the hospital back onto the streets with nowhere to heal. We encountered neighbors living with chronic health illnesses, with infected wounds, with unmanaged mental health conditions, and substance use disorders that had been shaped as much by trauma and grief as by chemistry. And somewhere along the way, our church began asking a dangerous kind of question. What if the church could become more than that which we inherited? What if church is not simply a place for people to come for spiritual comfort, while every other human need is exported, outsourced somewhere else? What if the church itself could become a part of the healing infrastructure of an entire community? And friends, that question changed us.
That question forced us to collaborate with people we had not always imagined as ministry partners. Physicians became collaborators in ministry. Researchers, peer recovery coaches, social workers, and people with lived experience of homelessness and addiction all became a part of this work. We discovered that the boundaries we often construct between the sacred and the secular are a lot more blurry than we imagine. The truth is, Jesus seemed remarkably unconcerned with maintaining those boundaries. His ministry happened in borrowed spaces and along roadsides. It happened around tables and among people that society had written off. Bodies were healed alongside relationships. The gospel was always physical as well as spiritual, communal as well as personal. And eventually, through Grace Clinic, Tony was connected to physicians willing to listen carefully and honestly. And together, they made a difficult decision, an amputation. And through the generosity of community partners, we were able to get Tony his own brand new prosthetic leg.
I will never, yeah, we can clap for Tony. Friends, I will never forget the day that Tony came walking into Galveston Central Church on his own 2 feet. I'd only ever seen Tony in a wheelchair or riding his bicycle with one leg. I didn't realize how tall he was. That day, Tony stood about 6 feet tall, but he might as well have been standing about 12 feet tall when he walked into the church that day. I watched him take steps on his own 2 feet for the first time in decades. And what happened next is just as remarkable as the surgery itself. Because after Tony received his prosthetic, a whole new world opened up for him. Tony quickly obtained permanent supportive housing. I mean, the absolute best part of our job is when we get to move folks into permanent supportive housing. There is no celebration like someone getting a roof over their head for the first time in years. And then, in the wonderfully ordinary way that life sometimes surprises us, Tony noticed the cute girl that was living in the apartment next door to him. And Tony met the love of his life, Valerie, the woman who lives next door. And last November, I had the privilege of officiating Tony and Valerie's wedding. And somewhere along the way, I realized that no denominational report I had ever filled out prepared me for how to account for this moment. There is no form that we have right now that asks how many weddings happened in your church because you opened up a clinic, right? There's no metric for measuring how many people rediscovered dignity because someone finally paused long enough to listen to their pain. There's no dashboard for tracking how many neighbors began imagining a new future again because of the compassion and the courage of a local church community.
But perhaps this is part of what it means to reimagine the church. Perhaps reimagining is not primarily about inventing flashy new programs or finding more effective branding strategies. Perhaps it's about recovering a larger imagination for what counts as ministry, for what counts as transformation, and for noticing where resurrection is actually happening. Because if all we measure are attendance patterns, giving units, and institutional survival, we may completely miss the holy things unfolding in our midst. At Central, this work has forced us to rethink almost everything: what counts as ministry, who counts as a minister, what our buildings are actually for, and how we define success. We think the church desperately needs this kind of holy imagination right now. Because sometimes resurrection looks dramatic and unmistakable.
Sometimes it looks like a man taking his first steps in 40 years.
Sometimes it looks like permanent housing.
Sometimes, thanks be to God, it looks like a wedding. Thank you.